Okay, so this presentation is coming from my collection of I've got roughly about 250 to 300 real photo postcards, postcards of railways. So it was kind of difficult to figure out what to choose here because, I mean, if I show them all to you, we'll be here all week. I don't think anybody really wants that. So I've selected a group of pictures that I thought were, kind of unique or kind of unusual from an historical perspective, or maybe had a little bit of a story behind them. In a few cases, they were just pictures that I liked. Okay. I do like to focus on smaller railways or railways that weren't around for very long, mainly because the items are a little bit unusual and they're maybe a little bit more rare. Okay, so just a very brief background. So picture postcards first began appearing in Canada in 1903. Many of the early postcards were produced by printers using an assortment of processes, typically like lithographs or colotypes. RPPC stands for Real Photo Postcard. RPC is another acronym that's used, which is Real Photo Cards. And these are actual photos that are printed onto postcard paper that was specially produced for that purpose. So my background is photography, so there is probably going to be a fair bit of technical information in there as well. The types of photographic themes that these photographers tended to do were mainly institutional buildings. That was a big thing. So they did schools and churches and libraries. And of course, train stations were a biggie, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, because in many cases, and especially in small towns, they were kind of the hubs of the community. That was the only place where they had a telephone, and it was the only place where they had a telegraph, that kind of thing. So they were pretty important places in their day. The advantage to real photo postcards is that they are rarely manipulated because there's a lot of trouble for the photographer to manipulate them. They would have actually had to go in there and retouch the negative, which would have been a lot of work for them. And it's probably not much in the way of payback. They were aesthetically pleasing. They were sharper and they had better detail. I mean, in some cases, you might have a picture of a train station, with maybe like a poster or something on the side, and you can look at that. And sometimes you can read the dates of the events. So it gives you some very good information. And they were also less subject to fading and other deterioration as long as they were properly processed and stored. So just very briefly about the photographers. We don't know who a lot of the photographers are. These are just unattributed. In some cases, they did put their names on them, which is great. Both the CPR and the Grand Trunk had their own staff photographers, and in many cases, the pictures were taken by staffers, but we don't know which ones because they're not attributed. That's a bit of a problem. Staff photographers for the CPR included Alexander Henderson, Joseph Heckman, and in later years, Nicholas Morant. And the Grand Trunk used John Wesley Swan. They used the Notman Studio and Reuben Sallows. So many of these pictures were likely just taken by local photographers. There were also traveling photographers that went around from one small town to another. They set up little portable studios, took family portraits and whatnot, and then went off on their own and took photos of, the buildings and whatnot that they would try to sell. This is a very good example of why real photo postcards are more preferred. So we can see this is a postcard view of the CPR station in Kenora. It was published in 1908 by a company called Valentine and Sons. They were an English company. They were kind of the premier postcard producer in Canada from about 1903 to about 1915. So we can see there's this, I don't know, it's a hydro pole or a telephone pole or something on the right there, and there's no pole on the left. And you can actually see, it's kind of interesting, there's a little bit of a mark over here. It's a bit lighter where they removed it. But if you actually look at the card on its own, without the reference point beside it, you don't really see that. So this company reportedly had a staff of about 300 people that were just sitting there, and they were removing hydro poles and, horses and extra people and things that they didn't want in these pictures. And they were also coloring these pictures because, of course, they didn't have color photography back then. So we don't really know what the original colors of these stations were. We can only guess. This was the guy that actually changed everything here. So this is a Kodak 3A folding pocket camera. It was autographic. It was first patented in the mid 1890s, and it was produced from 1903 to 1915. And Kodak actually marketed it as a postcard camera. These cameras sold at the time for $20 to $65, so amateurs could buy them. Now, the price equivalent today would be $650 to $2,100. But, you know, if they were $650 today, would still buy you a very decent digital camera. So they were affordable for a lot of people. They used a size 122 film, which was produced until 1971. And it produced 3¼ by 5½ inch size negatives. Now, not all the photographers used it. Some continued using their 4x5s and glass plate negatives. They were printed. They didn't have enlargers back then. That wasn't a thing. What actually we would call an enlarger was basically the size of my living room with a big sun coming in through the window in the background, and these things would be exposed all day. So what they did was they contact printed all these postcards. So to the right is an example of the paper that they used. So Kodak, Azo was a Kodak product. And you can see on there that it could be developed by Gaslight, which I'm sure was probably quite helpful back then. There were a number of other products that were produced. There was Azo, CKC, Solio, which I'll touch upon a little bit later, Velox. These were all marketed by Kodak. Ansco marketed a couple of products called Psycho and Noco. Now, one of the things that is important for dating is until 1904, cards were produced with undivided backs. So there actually was no room for a message. So you could see over here, I mean, this is what it was. And you flipped it over on the other side and you had your picture. So after 1904, they started coming out with the divided backs. You could put a message on one side, the address on the other. The other thing that's important is these stamp boxes over here. And this one we can see very clearly. It's got Azo and it's got 4 triangles pointed upward. And that would date the production years of the paper. So this particular paper was produced from 1904 to 1918. And if you have something else, there's a site called Playly or Playl, I don't know how you pronounce it, .com. And they have actually samples of all the different types of stamp boxes and the approximate dates that they were produced. So it's a good resource if you need to date something that doesn't have a stamp. Again, very briefly, retail postal outlets. These were actually on the trains. They were mail cars on the trains. And this was the fastest way that they could sort and deliver mail back then. So they would pick up the mail in one town, they would take it off to another, they would drop off the mail from there, they would pick up more mail. So that was how they did that. They did that until 1971. The railways owned the mail cars, and they were reimbursed by the post office. The staff that were working on these cars had to complete regular examinations every year. They had to be fully versed in postal law and regulations. And that lasted until they had been doing this for 20 years. And then I guess they figured there was nothing else for them to learn. And that service was in effect until 1971. These particular cards were a series that were produced. They covered basically mail delivery, and it was produced by the National Postal Museum, which of course no longer exists. All right, let's look at some pictures here. On our left, we have the Canadian Pacific Station. That was in Kuwait, Ontario. That was a photo that was taken by George Barraclough, who was based in Winnipeg. And this is an example of a card with an undivided back. And so you can see that this person went to a great deal of trouble to scrunch the message in around the border. Very nice of them. They tried to stay off the photo, which was just wonderful. But that is what they had to do until they came up with the divided back. The card on the right features the Grand Trunk Station, and that was in Springford, Ontario. That was mailed in 1908. And that was likely taken with a 4x5 camera. And just because when you measure that, the actual size of the image is 3x4. So I'm suspecting that the photographer probably put a mask in there and then went on to take the photo that way so they could have everything nicely centered and aligned. The bottom left is the CPR station in Dundalk. And I love this particular card. It's beautiful. This is a card that was actually affixed onto a piece of postcard type paper. So it's a real photo in there. You can't really see it very well from the scan, but if you go along the border, there's a nice little embossed pattern over here where they put the caption in. And, and then the rest of it is just the border over here. Now, I'm guessing that this must have been some kind of a special event because we have all these people lined up to meet the train. But I don't know what that was for. The card itself was published by somebody named O.R. McGee. He may have been a storekeeper there. It's dated 1911. And that's just a lovely card. To the right of that, we have the TNOR station. And anybody that doesn't know TNOR, that was the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, which was later renamed Ontario Northland. That's a station in Cobalt. We get the date from that car because I know that station was built in 1910. It replaced an earlier station that I think burned down. And out of the 4 stations on this particular slide, that's the only one that's still standing, unfortunately. It is now a museum. The top 2 photos there are from the National Transcontinental Railway, which only existed in name for a few years. It was a railway that was built by the Canadian government. Again, in the first and second decades of the 20th century. The picture on the left is the railway yards in Edmundston, New Brunswick. And to the right of that was the station in Edmundston, New Brunswick. The railway yards still exist. They're owned by CN. The train station does not exist. It was replaced in 1959 by a modern station, which is still standing and which actually has historical status. It's a lovely large brick station, and it's used commercially now. Bottom left is Lawrenceville, Quebec. That's a Canadian Pacific station. It's dated 1914. That's one of the ones that I chose because it's just a lovely photo of the station. It's kind of very evocative. You have the boxcar in the background, and to the right of that, you have the guy on the horse and the horses in the cart. Maybe he's waiting there to pick up mail for the railway. We don't know. That station, unfortunately, does not exist anymore. To the right of that is a station that was in a place called Shawbridge, Quebec, which has now been renamed Prévost. That was due to amalgamation of several communities. That station is still standing. It is a cafe and cultural center, and I had a look at it on Google Street View, and it looks great. I mean, it looks fantastic. Prévost, or Shawbridge at the time, was kind of an interesting place. It was a tourist location for skiing. One of the ski tolls was owned by a guy named Herman. His nickname was Jackrabbit Johansson. He was instrumental in establishing Quebec's ski industry. He was a Norwegian engineer, professional skier. He arrived in Quebec in 1928, and he virtually set up the entire ski industry in the Laurentians. He began skiing at the age of 2, and he continued until he reached the age of 106. He passed away in 1987 at the age of 111, and at that point, he was the oldest man in the world. An interesting fellow. Okay, on the left, that's an example of postcards that are printed on that Solio paper. Solio paper is something that was called a printing out paper. So what they did was they put their negative and they put their piece of paper in their contact frame, and they just kind of let it cook until there was an image there. And then they would fix it, and that would be the end of it. It did not go through a development process. And unfortunately, these cards and Solio paper did not stand the test of time well. What you're seeing here looks very faint, and that was, believe me, that was heavily enhanced in Photoshop. So it's the actual card itself is barely visible, which is too bad. The Solio paper was discontinued in 1940. To the right of that is the Grand Trunk Station in Washego. Now, if anybody here has been to Washego, which is a lovely little community about 20 kilometers north of Orillia, there is a station there. That's not the same station. What happened was there were two railways passing through Oswego, which was the Grand Trunk and the Canadian Northern. Both those railways were eventually amalgamated into CN. And for whatever reason, well, probably because the CNOR station was newer, that was the one that CN chose to keep. It was a newer station. It was maybe a bit larger. It was a better looking station. That station actually still stands, but not this one. We don't know what happened to this one. It was built in 1890, and it was probably demolished. To the left of that is just a typical railway scene. It's in Sandpoint, Ontario. It's CPR. It was taken by a photographer named Gus Hanford, who was based in Renfrew. And the Hanford family, they were very, very prominent photographers in Renfrew. They first set up their studio in the 1890s, and they kept it going until 1975. They left their full collection of negatives, which include glass plates, cellulose, nitrate negatives from 1895 to 1975, with the Arnprior and McNabb and Brayside archives. And so presumably whatever they produced for postcards is on file there also. To the right of that is the Grand Trunk Station in Wales, Ontario. If you haven't heard of Wales, there's a good reason. It was inundated in 1957 when they built the St. Lawrence Seaway. So that station would have been demolished. It was taken by Harrington and Son. Harrington and Son was Henry Harrington, and the son was Clarence. They were from Trenton, and they traveled all around kind of southeast Ontario, taking pictures of small towns, railway stations, stores, whatever else was around there. And they produced quite a bit until about 1920. Then they basically gave up photography, went on to other things. Their photos are considered to be very collectible. So if you ever do see them at a show or whatever, you'll find that they're quite expensive, and that's why. Moving right along here. On the left there, on the upper left, we have the New York Central Railroad in Ottawa. Now, the New York Central Railroad was very prominent in southwest Ontario and also in southern Quebec. But they had a branch line that was known as the New York and Ottawa Railway that went up through the Adirondacks, up through upstate New York, into Cornwall, and then up into the Ottawa area where they had service in a lot of different little towns. I don't think they didn't have a station in Ottawa, so they may have been using the GTR station, which was known as a Union station. Not really sure about that. But anyway, they did maintain a roundhouse in Ottawa, which I didn't know about until I found that postcard, and I thought, that's really pretty good. That was produced on cycle paper that was produced from 1904 to 1908. And to the right of us, we have an accident. Accidents were a biggie. That was kind of a really early form of reportage. Well, that was the Central Ontario Railway, and that one I figured out because I was able to zero in with a magnifier on one of the passenger cars in the background. So I don't know where that took place. Central Ontario Railway ran from Trenton up through Eastern Ontario, up I think as far as Maynooth. And then it was taken over by the Canadian Northern Railway. That was in 1911. So we know this card predates 1911. It was printed on azo paper 1904 to 18. And I tried to find information on this accident, and I couldn't. So I guess it was just kind of another fender bender type railway accident. Bottom, that is Sarnia. I don't know if any of you have been to Sarnia or if you're familiar with this. That is the St. Clair Tunnel. And that was the first underwater tunnel that was ever built in North America. So it went from Sarnia and crossed underneath the St. Clair River to Port Huron, Michigan. Came out at the other end. It's considered to this day, even to this day, it's considered to be a major feat of civil engineering. It has historical status in Ontario, Canada. On the American side, it has historical status as well. It was built in 1888, and it opened, I think, officially in 1891. Now, one problem that they found out with the tunnel is when the locomotives were going through, Sometimes they would have to recouple them or they would decouple, they ran into problems. So they would have to recouple them inside the tunnel. Fumes were extremely toxic. A number of railway workers lost their lives in those tunnels. So what happened in 1908 was the Grand Trunk, who owned the line at that point, came up with a system where in Sarnia and in Port Huron, they would switch over to an electric locomotive. So they would use electricity to go under the tunnel, and then when they got to the other side of the tunnel, they would switch back to a steam locomotive. That lasted until 1958 when they switched over to diesel. These particular pictures were taken by a photographer named Louis Pesha. He also was highly collectible. He was born in 1868. He died in 1912. He was from Southwest Ontario. But he ended up settling in Michigan. He traveled around to a lot of small towns and he would take pictures, all kinds of just little pictures of stores and other types of buildings, which he would peddle through advertisements, journals, and magazines. He was killed in a car accident in 1912. His wife carried on the business until 1920, then she closed it up, destroyed all his negatives, which is one of the reasons why they're so collectible these days. So on the left, we have a view of the tunnel, and that's on the Sarnia side. And on the right, we have a view of we're looking out from inside the tunnel and you can see the electric locomotive there in the background. That tunnel still exists. The tracks have been lifted. It's been sealed. There's a new tunnel beside it, the Tellier Tunnel, which had to be built because this tunnel was not high enough to accommodate the intermodal vehicles that the railways were using by then. Hey, on the left here, here's some railway yards. And the one on the left is in North Battleford, Saskatchewan. That was Canadian Northern. I don't know too much about the photographer, E.L. Lane. I guess it was a local photographer. I couldn't find any information on this person. To the right, we have the White River, Ontario CPR yards. One interesting thing to note when you're dating these cards is these little caption items that are over here. And those were done roughly until about 1925. That was one way of identifying them. Sometimes they would, use a little template with the actual printed information on there. But this little caption box was another way that they did that. Bottom left, we have the CPR yards in what was then Fort William, now Thunder Bay. And that's, I think, from 1906. And to the right, we have a later view of CPR yards back in White River. You can see some diesels in there. So that would be from the 1950s. And all of these yards are still in use by the railways. Here's some rolling stock over here. Upper left, we have the Canadian Government Railways. And those are really rare. The Canadian Government Railway only existed in name for 3 years. And it was like an umbrella group where the government was putting all their railways so they could manage them. They owned the NTR, they owned a couple of railways in the Maritimes. And so they put everything under Canadian Government Railways as a way of managing it. They used the reporting mark of CGR. So to see something with CGR is unusual. To the right of that, and this is actually one of my favorites, was the Carillon and Granville Railway. That's a picture that dates from 1909. The Carillon and Granville Railway was a portage railway. It made one trip a day between the Carillon and Granville Islands, which are on the west side of Quebec, just across from Ontario. They're on the Ottawa River. And they would do that once a day to pick up and deliver passengers from the steamer. This railway operated from 1854 to 1910. And that's a broad gauge locomotive. If you're wondering why it's so unusual looking, it's a great looking train. There's a little caption here on the bottom. It's in French, but it basically says that it's the oldest train in the country, and it probably was. It was scrapped in 1910, unfortunately, when they shut down the railway. It's too bad. It would have been a nice museum piece. Bottom left is a Grand Trunk railway car. That's from 1901. And to the right of that is a Canadian Northern passenger car. And I don't have a date on that one. It's from probably about 1905 and 1910. These both came from the Locomotive Publishing Company in London, which I'm guessing was a railway publication. It no longer exists. Okay, on the left is the Grand Trunk Pacific shops, and that's in Transcona, Manitoba. Transcona is now a suburb, but it's part of Winnipeg now. Don't have much information on that other than it's an AZO 1904 to 18. It's not mailed. And the railway yards are still there in Transcona, CN yards now. To the right of that was Canadian Northern in Winnipeg. That was an exhibit display. And that was done for the Manitoba Industrial Exhibition. And that was a really popular event. It went from 1907 to 1914. They offered circus acts, they had a midway, they had fireworks. It lasted a week and it attracted well over 200,000 people, which is quite a lot of people considering the rather sparse population in Manitoba at the time. It was beset with financial problems, unfortunately. It came into an end in 1915 and it was not revived again until 1952 as the Red River Exhibition. The photo itself was taken by a Winnipeg photographer named Morris Lyle, and we will look at him very briefly. Actually, we'll look at him, I think he's on the next slide. Now, some people really love the messages that are on the backs of these cards. I'm kind of indifferent to them, but this one caught my eye because I looked at the stamp box and I knew it was 1904 to 1918, and I looked at the postmark on there and it was 1968 and I kind of went, what? Anyway, there was a message on the back of this, which I'll read to you. It was, "Dear Marjorie and Bob, I knew this card would come in handy someday." 50 years later, sitting in a drawer, okay. Then it goes on. "Marshall McLuhan asked Renee to do a mural for the Center for Cultural and Technological Development for a single fee. So I feel as though I were living with a dynamo. One can almost hear the creative wheels beginning to purr into production. So I had to tell my relatives, naturally." Signed, Betty Sierra. So I looked up this couple. So the artist was René Sierra. He was born in 1895. He died in 1992. He was a French-born artist. He moved to Canada, 1928. Had a very productive career as an illustrator with the Eaton Company for many years. And he retired, became a painter, and produced this painting called Pied Pipers, which was the painting that he produced for Professor McLuhan. And that painting is on permanent display at the McLuhan Center for Cultural and Technology at the U of T. So if you're ever down there and you want to have a look, there it is. His wife was Betty, also known as Liz. She was from Killarney, Manitoba. And I guess that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise because McLuhan was from Manitoba also. Betty was an established artist in her own right, and she was also a writer. She was born in 1915 and she died in 1999. Now, these are photos that were taken by Morris Lyle, who, as you can see, was a really wonderful photographer. This was what was known as the Union Station in Winnipeg. It was called the Union Station because it was built by the Canadian Northern. It was supposed to be for the Canadian Northern and Grand Trunk Pacific, but of course they both got absorbed by CNs, then became the CN station. I grew up in Winnipeg and I remember it being the CN station. The station's still standing and is now owned by VIA. It is still in use. It has apparently also, I've been in it a few times, but apparently it was also restored quite recently. So beautiful station, as you can see. I love this photo over here with all the, just the rows and rows of railway track behind the station, all the horses lined up in front. This is great. The photo on the bottom right, the one of the waiting room, that was actually reproduced by the Valentine Company on a number of cards as well. So I guess he, kind of sold the rights to them or whatever. So on the left here, we have that's the upper left is the station in Rivers, Manitoba. And Rivers was a Grand Trunk Pacific station. The town of Rivers was established in 1908 as a major divisional point. It was named after Sir Charles Rivers Wilson, who at the time was the railway president. And the first station opened in September 1908. It was destroyed by fire in 1917, and the station was replaced the same year. That station is still standing. There is a group in Rivers that have for many years been raising money to try and restore the station. I don't think they've been totally successful, but they're still working on it. It's still standing, which is a good thing. To the right, we have the CPR station in Alameda, Saskatchewan. That particular card was mailed in 1911. And again, I chose that card because it's just because of the lovely sepia tone. It's really an attractive card. It's got kind of that real Saskatchewan feel, with all the grain elevators and whatnot. That station was replaced in 1922 by another station. And interestingly, both stations are still standing and they're both private homes. So that's good to know. Bottom left, another Grand Trunk Pacific station that was in Wainwright, Alberta. That was taken by a photographer who's named John Henry Gano. He was born in 1873, died in 1947. He is American. He's kind of back and forth between the US and Canada over many, many years. He eventually ended up settling in Alberta. I think he settled in Red Deer at the very end. Yes, he did. He settled in Red Deer in 1941. He also spent a number of years in Saskatchewan. He was kind of all over the place. The University of Calgary have his fonds on file. That card was not used. I would guess it was probably from about 1908, 1910, thereabouts. That station stood until 1928, and it burned down. CN replaced the station, and they replaced one that looked very similar to that station, only it was larger. And that station is still standing, the second station. And it's now a museum in Wainwright. To the right of that is the Canadian Northern Station, the first one in Saskatoon. And when I saw that, my first thoughts were, I know that station. I've seen that picture before, but it was a CPR station. Well, it was. So it's kind of unusual. But that particular station was built in 1890 by the Capel, Long Lake, and Saskatchewan Railroad and Steamboat Company, Long Lake. The railway was leased to the CPR in 1899, and the CPR, for whatever reason, didn't want it, and they sold it to the CNOR in 1906. That particular card was mailed in 1908. The photo was taken by Peter Mackenzie. He was born in 1881, died in 1965. He's originally from Ontario. It's like one of many of these railway guys. They wore a lot of different hats. This guy was also a blacksmith. He was a painter. He was a farmer. He did carpentry. Then he took up photography, and he started submitting photos to the Saskatoon Phoenix newspaper. He also operated a photo studio. He did that for many years. And then in 1918, he went back to Ontario, set up a portrait business, and he also did painting. That particular station stood until 1910. Canadian Northern Railway demolished it, replaced it with a much more elaborate structure. A very beautiful structure. It was actually replicated in downtown Saskatoon. Anyway. Okay, the top. Mirror, Alberta. And I have to admit, I chose those cards because I love the name of that place. I mean, it's fantastic. Mirror. What a great name. Mirror became a divisional point on the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway in 1912. And it was actually named for the London Daily Mirror, which was kind of unusual. It was quite a thriving little community for a number of years. It had a hotel, it had a post office, a lumber yard, it had hardware and drugstores, 3 churches, railway buildings, and even had a doctor. That all came to an end in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when CN dieselized, and they kind of went, we don't need the roundhouse anymore, so that came down. The station stood until 1975 when it was destroyed by fire, which is too bad. Mirror still exists, but it's a tiny little hamlet now. They actually had their status changed from a town to a hamlet back in 2004 because the population had diminished by so much. Bottom, again, we have two pictures from the Grand Trunk Pacific. We have the Grand Trunk Pacific Roundhouse in McBride, BC, and then we have another roundhouse in Melville, Saskatchewan. Both the stations in those communities still exist, and they are both in use by Via Rail, which is very good. Apparently very attractive stations too. They've been nicely restored. Melville was named for Charles Melville Hayes. He was the CEO and general manager of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railways. He went down in the Titanic in 1912. They did recover his body. He's buried in Montreal. Okay, on the left there, and that's another photo. That's another card that I chose just because it's such a beautiful photo. I have not been able to find out anything about the Cottonwood Flats Bridge other than the fact that it's in BC. The photo itself dates from about 1930, and it was taken by a photographic studio called Gowan Sutton, which we're going to look at very shortly. To the right of that is also the Grand Trunk Pacific. That was the Prince Rupert Wharf in BC. The Grand Trunk Pacific, when it was first conceived, they had this great idea that Prince Rupert was going to be that was going to be a wharf of the future. That was going to be a major shipping center. Well, it is a major shipping center now, but it wasn't 100 years ago, so that hurt the railway by quite a bit. That card was mailed in 1916. The photo was taken by a photographer named Fred Button. He's from the United Kingdom. He settled in Canada for a while and ended up in Texas. Bottom left is the Lower Spiral Tunnel. And that's from the CPR. That was taken by Byron Hill Harmon. He was born in 1876. He died in 1942. He was also an American. He moved to Banff in 1903, opened a photography business. He was a superb landscape photographer, like Gowan Sutton, who were also superb photographers. And Byron Harmon has traditionally been associated by the CPR. In fact, he produced a whole series, like hundreds and hundreds of pictures that are all entitled on the back along the lines of the CPR. He never worked for them. He worked for himself. He copyrighted his own postcards. But he did sell them through the CPR, and they sold them in their stations and hotels and, and various other retail outlets. His son continued operating the business until the late 1950s. They still have a website for Byron Harmon. His grandchildren and his great-grandchildren still sell prints of their photos that you can buy. There is a collection of over 6,000 negatives, which are now housed and maintained by the White Museum in the Canadian Rockies. But again, he is a very highly respected photographer. To the right of that, we're back to Gowan Sutton. And that would have been from the 1940s with the diesel train there. And this is quite unusual because what Gowan Sutton was best known for was hand coloring their photos. So this is an actual real photo postcard, but it is hand colored, which you can tell by the blue clouds. They weren't all that precise with their hand coloring. And again, because they didn't have color photography, it was a way to, really make their postcards stand out. Now, the Gowan Sutton Company was a Vancouver-based photography studio. They opened in 1920, and they were started by Frank Gowan and Alfred Sutton. Frank Gowan left the firm in 1930 and sold his share to Sutton. His wife was terminally ill, and he wanted to spend more time with her. They are probably the most well-known postcard producer from the West Coast. We don't know who took their photos. They had several photographers: John Anderson Jardine, David Chisholm Hay, Frederick William George Blythe, and another one called Joseph Fred Spalding, who we're going to look at very briefly as well. So here we are, moving on. It's a little bit more Gowan Sutton here. So the upper left, that is CPR Hotel and Station in Sycamus, BC. So that was a hotel with, as you can see, the station is down on the very ground floor there. You can see the tracks over here. This hotel and station were built in 1897. They were enlarged extensively in 1908. That's when they added the third floor on the station over here. There is a website in BC that has interior photos of this hotel because it was quite beautiful inside. It had a total of 53 rooms. It was quite popular for many years. Then it fell on hard times. CPR demolished the whole thing in 1964, which is too bad. There is a replica station that is built in BC. Sorry, a replica hotel that covers that. To the right of that is the CN station in Vancouver. It was a photo that was taken by Sidney Jack Hayward. He was born in 1885. He died in 1956. He was based in Montreal, actually, but he was a very busy commercial photographer. Had his own studio, did a lot of industrial and commercial work. That station was built in 1919 by the Canadian Northern Railway, and it remains in use as a transportation hub. Bottom left, we have another Gowan Sutton postcard. That was in Revelstoke, BC. That was the station. There's a whole series of those. I've got about half a dozen of those shown by Gowan Sutton. The Revelstoke station was built in 1905. It replaced an earlier station. It was demolished in 1978. And then in 1992, they put up another structure there, which is now a railway museum. And if you're ever out there, it's a really good museum. It's well worth seeing. You can spend quite a few hours there. A lot to see, a lot of exhibits, a lot of rolling stock. It's a very good place. To the right of that, we're going to reacquaint ourselves here with Fred Spalding. Fred Spalding was born in 1877. He died in 1958. He was sales manager when he was working for Gowan Sutton, but he was also a photographer. And 1948, he decided to branch out on his own and also produce hand-colored photos and have a few other Spalding photos. And one of the differences you'll note between Revelstoke and Penticton is Spalding tended to use much bolder, more intense colors, whereas the colors that you see that Gowan Sutton used were very soft and very muted. So he was using maybe different techniques, different materials. The station that's pictured here was in Penticton. It is still standing. It was built in 1941. It's designed to accommodate boat traffic and passenger transfers from ship to train. After the railway left, the Kinsman Group took over the station. They operated it for about 30 years. And they handed it over to a group called One Sky, which is a charitable group that offers community resources for families and seniors. So it still remains in use in a very good capacity. Now we're back in Ontario here. So here we are in Northern Ontario. The two pictures at the top were taken by a photographer named Harry Fisher. He was from Geraldton. The photo on the left is Makina. It was a Velox print. It was never mailed, but it was from the 1940s. I was able to date that one from the stamp box. The Makina station still exists. It's in use by Via Rail. To the right of that, we have the station in Long Lac. That station is no longer standing. That particular section of the line was abandoned about 20 years ago. We don't know a lot about Harry Fisher. He lived in Geraldton. He was a commercial photographer, kind of specialized in industrial work. A lot of mining going on there, a lot of hydro construction that was going on there. He took a lot of those photos of hydro dams and mines. He was also active in municipal affairs. He was, I believe he was a counselor at one point, and he also worked in Geraldton as the municipal tax assessor, which I don't imagine made him the most popular guy in town. Bottom left, we have the railway yards and roundhouse. I always pronounce this place Schreiber, but they don't. They call it Scriber. So, okay, we'll go with the local pronunciation. That's from the 1940s. That's the CPR. It's a really beautiful aerial photo. It was taken by a company called the Camera Shop, which was located in Port Arthur. And the camera shop was kind of interesting. There was a family of photographers that arrived in the Thunder Bay area in the 19 teens. So the name was Lovelady. It's a wonderful name, really extraordinary. He was a father and two sons. The father eventually retired. The sons took over the business. One of them was named Harold. Eventually, in the 1930s, the two brothers branched off on their own. Harold formed his own company, and the other brother, I don't know his first name, unfortunately, he set up the camera shop, which did commercial photography, and they also did, I believe they sold cameras and they did photoshopping, and they were around from the 1930s to about 1960. And I have a few other aerial pictures from them as well, not railway stuff, but they were extremely good railway aerial photographers. So I don't know if one of them was I don't know if one of them was a flyer or if they had, anyway, they were very good at it. And knowing aerial photography, it's not easy to do. To the right is the Lake of Bays, which was a portage railway that ran on narrow gauge. It connected steamboats that operated on the Lake of Bays and Peninsula Lake in Muskoka. It billed itself, or it branded itself, as the smallest commercially operated railway in the world. It operated from 1905 to 1959. That particular photo was taken by the Winger Studio, which I believe was based in Utterson. The Lake of Bays Railway has been revived as a heritage railway. So if you want to take a ride on it, it operates during the summer. With volunteers. You can find them on their website, and you have to go up to Huntsville to take the trip. We're back in Quebec now. Okay, so I'm going to go to Quebec. That was a picture that was taken by R. Olivier, mailed in 1933, the CPR station. It is no longer standing. It's a lovely photo. I don't know anything about R. Olivier, so I can't give you any information on him or her. Might have been her. To the right of that is the CN station in Montreal, which opened in 1943. That station is still in operation as basically a transportation hub. When it was opened by CN, it replaced two older stations that they had inherited from the Grand Trunk and the Canadian Northern Railway. The photo itself was produced by Air Maps. Air Maps was a company that I think they set up in the 19 teens, and they would basically fly. They were based in Ontario. Fly around. They would take aerial photos of all these different communities, which presumably they sold to government officials and commercially and whatnot. They didn't produce a lot of postcards. They did them. They started producing them, I think, in the 1930s. And this one is from the 1940s, and they didn't produce very many, and they didn't produce them for very long. The bottom left is the CPR station in the Chute. That station is also still standing. It's not used as a railway station, obviously. It's now a community service hub. It was built in 1929 by the CPR. It replaced an earlier station. It was enlarged in 1940, and then it was closed in the 1950s, and it was abandoned for almost 30 years. They began restoring it in 1991. It now has heritage status, and it's currently being used as a community service hub. The photo was taken by Bernard Bogue. He lived in Hawkesbury, Ontario. I don't know too much about him, except that there is a Bogue photo in Hawkesbury still. I don't know what they do. They don't seem to do photo finishing. Okay. To the right of that, it's a station in Acton Vale. That's a CN station. It was built by the Grand Trunk in 1900, and it became a designated historical site in 1974. If you look at it on Google, it's been beautifully restored. It's just gorgeous. Great job. It looks great. It's now a tourist office and an exhibition center. That photo dates from about the 1930s. This is the last slide here in the presentation. And if anybody can give me information on this, I would love it. This is a group of pictures of stations in BC, and they were all taken 1969, 1970. There's at least 30 or 35 pictures in this series. I have 21 of them. I don't know anything about them. I don't know the circumstances under which they were taken. I don't know who the photographer was. I don't know if it was just somebody driving around with a camera and producing postcards or what they were. They were all printed on Kodak paper, which is about all you could get back then. And yeah, that's all I know about them. So if anybody ever knows any information about them, please let me know. I'd love to get more. None of these stations are standing, with the exception of Kamloops, which I think is still in use by Via Rail. So that's it.